Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Profluent Sports. Got my man Rufus Hack here from Sony Sports. Rufus, appreciate you hopping on. Excited to do this one today.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. Looking forward to it.
So, how's gray February London treating you at the moment?
It is grey, although it's not as cold as I was over at your neck of the woods in New York and then Phoenix last week, and New York was incredibly cold. I was meant to be coming over with 3 colleagues, and I was the only one who managed to get over with the flights getting cancelled.
It's nuts, right? So glad you got here, and you came a week before, right? It seems like everyone's here in the States now for Super Bowl and Waste Management and All-Star. So you beat the
I was
rush
thinking
on that.
I've been to the last 2 Super Bowls, but I've had a few scare stories about how hard it is to get out to the stadium in San Francisco, so I'm not traveling this weekend.
I love it. So give us the rundown before we get into Sony Sports, some of the subsidiaries, what you guys are doing, how you see the space, right? But who are you? You know, what have you done? How did you end up in this role? I think that'll paint some helpful context to
Yeah, for
listeners.
sure. So I spent my early part of the career as a strategy consultant for 10 years. Then I went to work at the PGA European Tour and the Ryder Cup, ended up being the chief operating officer at the European Tour and Ryder Cup, oversaw 3 or 4 Ryder Cups at Hazeltine and Paris and Whistling Straits. And then for the last 5 years, I've been the CEO of Sony Sports. And we're trying to bring together leading sports tech businesses in the world of sport and trying to create a family of the best sports businesses.
So give us the rundown. I think we've had, and sometimes I lose track of episodes, but I know we had, I'm going to say it's Adit from Sony Ventures side on. You know, we've had technologies in and around that. I want to say we had the Hawkeye, one of who was running that at the time on. How does it sit? What does it look like? What's the structure just for people from the outside looking in to understand how this all operates in and around Sony?
So our ambition is to create the 4th big entertainment genre within Sony. So you've got Sony Pictures, Sony Music and Sony PlayStation. We want Sony Sports to sit on a par with those businesses because we think with the sort of the festivalization of sport and the convergence of all of these different entertainment genres, there's huge opportunity through having a material business in sports. And so we've started to build out that through the buy and build strategy of when I joined, we had 1.5 businesses. We've now got 5 brands. And we're trying to realize the synergies that exist between those sports data and tech businesses and then go out to market. And we're now privileged. We work with 23 of the top 25 sports leagues globally, including the NFLs and the NBAs and the FIFAs and the ICCs and over 1,200 of the leading sports teams. We've managed to get some reasonable scale over the last 5 years or so.
Yeah, and touch on that real quick, festivalization of sports. Just curious what you mean. Like, I understand it, but just from an audience standpoint, how you guys are at least internally talking about that.
I mean, whenever we speak to the commissioners and the CEOs of sports leagues, there's 2 things that seem to pop up. One is how do I engage younger people? And 2, how do I create more of a entertainment product around my sport? And how do I move from just engaging people with my live content to actually creating 365 always on content? And obviously there's certain tentpole events that do that really well. But if you can start to do that on the run of the week, individual games, it creates huge opportunity. I mean, when we were young, it was just all about live, whereas about 50% of the value today in sports content is non-live. So there's a huge change there and a huge opportunity to bring in other assets and other entertainment genres to really make sport a real spectacle.
Now, talk to us about the different companies you've acquired. Or what was Sony Sports at the start? Like, did it, come in with an acquisition? What was the start? And then go through sort of the, stepping stones in each acquisition and the companies.
For sure, yeah. So Sony bought Hawkeye in 2011, before my time. And Hawkeye at the time was a $5 million backwater company. It's now one of the largest companies in the sports tech and sports data space. So we effectively collect sports data at pretty much every global sports event that happens. As I said before, with all of the big US leagues, the NBA, the NHL, the NFL, MLB, the FIFAs, the ICCs, the World Rugbies. And we have our cameras installed at every single stadium and it's collecting data at those events. And that's optical tracking, skeletal data of the athlete. So 29 points on an athlete's body in sub 1 second latency, 500 frames a second. So you're capturing huge amounts of data. And initially, Hawkeye grew up with using that for officiating. So we do it in soccer for VAR, goal line technology, and automated officiating. We do it in tennis for line calling, as I'm sure you've seen at the majors. And then the last few years, we've really focused on the US sport. So we're currently working with the NBA at the moment. Adam Silver's big thing is, how do I make the fourth quarter quicker? So we're looking to use the data and the tracking data that we're collecting to automate ball out of bounds and goaltending reviews. We started working with the NFL about 18 months ago to automate line to gain, and there's lots of conjecture about automating now where the ball is spotted. We're working with the MLB on automatic balls and strikes, which has been voted by the owners to be introduced next year. We're working with the NHL on high sticking and offsides. And so that is one vector that you can potentially use this data for. And it's something that the commissioners, they've all got different reasons for wanting to bring it in, but it's something they're incredibly passionate about because it impacts the purity, the speed, and the efficacy of the game. And then we've been buying other businesses to almost put in and around that ecosystem to unlock the value of the data for other use cases. So, for example, we bought a business called Kinetrax, which is based down in Florida about 3 years ago. They take the biomechanical data and work with 22 of the 30 MLB teams and many of the NBA and NHL teams to allow performance coaches and medical staff to see both in real time and after the event how the biomechanical profile of the players is changing. And so you can actually start to use it in-game now, where if a pitcher is starting to over-rotate their rotator cuff, you might pull them off after the sixth innings rather than after the seventh innings. If a footballer is starting to reduce their stride length, you might infer that they're carrying an injury and you might pull them off at a certain point. Then you can obviously use that subsequently for load management, medical injury prevention, etc. That's just two of the examples.
Now, when you guys look to, I'm assuming you're continually looking in the space for new ones or things that fit in. What's the strategy there? What are you looking for, right? Because, again, you weren't there. It's 2011, but these weren't massive businesses. These weren't huge scale, right? Some of them were still in very much let's just call it like Series A, earlier stage startup phase when you guys came in and acquired them. And again, I don't know what the structure and how that all looks like post, acquisition, but what are some of those things you're looking for? Is it it has to tie into all the other verticals, or it has to really help one vertical, or it's revenue, or what's some of the things you guys look for?
Yeah, so Hawkeye's very much our anchor asset now, in that it has the distribution with most leading rights holders, and it collects the data at high fidelity, low latency that is extremely valuable. And then that business has grown from, as I said, a very $1 million business to a multi $100 million business now. So that has got some reasonable scale. And then our big strategy is, we call it almost, we want to be the machine that powers the world of sport. And so Hawkeye sits in the middle of that, collecting optical skeletal data. We've recently also bought another business, Stat Sports, who collect the active tracking, so the vests that a lot of footballers wear. We work with the Dodgers, the Commanders, etc., collect other forms of data. But once you have that data, the ability to then productize it not only for officiating, but for performance. We've bought another business in the fan engagement space, Beyond Sports, which is around recreating the data into new fan engagement experiences. There's obviously the betting angle for the data. There's the media angle in terms of different narratives. So we're really looking for businesses that are synergistic with our unlocking the power of data thesis. And we remain incredibly bullish about the sports tech industry. I mean, if you look at the inflation in all of the sports IP that we're seeing globally, they need these second level enablers in order to drive that growth. We're seeing huge changes in sports consumption and the business model of sport. Ultimately, you need the machinery of sport and the sports tech and data underlying assets to evolve. And so for us, that's powering significant 15 to 20% CAGR growth in the markets in which we operate.
And I appreciate the perspective on that for how you guys are looking at it. Now, how are you implementing them in post-acquisition? I'm sure that's a dog and pony show in itself of, you got to bring in new team members and you got to figure out how these things all work, and tech's got to integrate and tech stacks. And, what does it look like then post, what you guys just did stat sports, for example, right? Maybe
Yeah.
that's a good one to go through.
Yeah.
What does
So
that look like? How you build it all in and make sure that it all becomes sort of around that anchor asset, like you said.
So, firstly, what we sort of look for when we think about the businesses, we look for standalone businesses where we think there is shareholder value. We look for businesses which we think are synergistic with our existing portfolio. And then the third thing that we look for is we look for businesses that have the X factor, which are going to do something new in the sports industry. Like, I think it's relatively safe to say some of the stuff that Hawkeye has done in global sports has genuinely revolutionized the sport and officiating in that sport. I think it's fair to say some of the stuff that we've done with Beyond Sports in the fan engagement space, where we've recreated NFL games in Disney IP, and you're getting 14-year-olds watching the game and 60% of the audience haven't seen the game before, is genuinely revolutionary. So we always put that filter on. If we don't just want to buy businesses for scale, we want to buy businesses which have that X factor. And then because they've got that X factor, we want to empower them to keep that DNA. So the way that we integrate is relatively softly. Like some of the back end plumbing, we'll integrate that immediately. The HR, the finance, the legal, etc. The front office we will try and bring together so we can have a integrated offering to the leagues and teams in terms of our sales and our go-to-market. And that's something that we're hearing increasingly from teams and leagues. They say that this space is just so fragmented, and if there's one supplier who can bring it together and help them make sure there are less friction points in that supply chain, they're all up for that. And then the middle office is sort of where we try and keep it separate and keep that secret sauce. And so we really want to empower the founders to continue to succeed. We want to give them the autonomy to drive growth and be creative, and the freedom to breathe. And we want to keep what's made them unique whole, rather than trying to put too many corporate protocols or covenants in place.
Yeah, because you're saying what made them great in essence was a little bit of the freedom, and I like the front office, middle office, back office analogies. That makes a lot of sense. So I've been playing PlayStation, Sony, since I've been a little kid, and it's just pretty cool. I think you'll appreciate this, obviously, being in the weeds of it, but I don't know, I played through 2020, 2021, whatever it was, and this was all through like PS4, and then I took a few years off, and then, was like, hey, I got the itch again, so I bought a PS5, got all the new games and the motion dynamics and how all the players move, and everything like seemed completely different. A lot of people complain, oh, every year feels the same, but it's like if you take only a few years apart, you saw massive differences. Now, as you start to plug these things in, for example, on the sports side, and you're using the, Kinetrax and starting to analyze, now how are you shifting it over to then, call it like Sony PlayStation? Like, is that impacting that and making that game better? And then is it making content better for Sony Productions? How does that then all start to flow to the other vehicles?
It's a great question, Andrew, and it's something that we're really focused on, and cognizant that we're incredibly lucky to have the PlayStation platform with 160 million monthly active users in the family. So we start from the fact that the sports industry has done an awful job over the last 5 to 10 years of engaging younger fans. I think there's a stat that globally, if you're under the age of 20, there's a 10% less chance you're an avid sports fan than over the age of 20. I personally don't believe there's anything structural there. I just think that the industry has done a bad job of evolving with consumption habits. And so one of the things we're incredibly excited about is starting, and we're on this journey at the moment, to use the PlayStation as an opportunity to make sports consumption more participative. And we have all of the raw ingredients and the tools that we need to do that. So we are in the stadium collecting this data at super low latency. We are then able to put that into a virtual environment and recreate the game, again, in sub 1 second latency, quicker than the broadcast goes out. Once that data is in that virtual environment, you can watch the game effectively from any camera angle. You're not constrained by what the producer wants you to see. You can see it from above, from below, from the player's point of view. You can analyze replays because all of the game is played out in that digital environment. The next step for that is then thinking about how can you actually gamify that more. So, for example, MLB The Studios is a PlayStation Studios production. You can potentially watch the first 3 innings of a game and then take over in the 4th innings and play the game yourself. Or you can potentially use, we've been spending the last 2 years working with Cambridge University to develop a prediction tool of, based on billions of previous data points, how is the game going to play out? You can start to use that data. And so one of the things that we're investigating in soccer is if you actually make a substitution and you play out your version of the game side by side with the real life game, can you make better tactical decisions than the coach? So we see lots of opportunities to leverage the user base and the power of the PlayStation platform allied with the data that we have to create those more immersive participant sports experiences. And the great thing about that is it's incredibly scalable. Once you've built those, you can scale those to other sports and you can scale it to other products and platforms relatively quickly.
Yeah, it's super cool. And if you ever need someone to test out the games or the models, you gotta volunteer right here. But anyway, now how do you talked about different sports and the scaling right there at the end even. How do you start to use all of this to evaluate emerging sports or ones on the rising, whether that's for building new, I don't know, you're sitting on the Sony Sports side, but whether it's for building new video games because you see, hey, there could be enough of an audience here, or you're seeing a ton of attention over here and you're like, hey, here's a sport we need to put more focus on building in all your Sony Sports companies. Like how do you start to look at those as we're seeing a ton of I talk about the rise of emerging leagues and emerging sports all the time.
Yeah. So it's something that we're very focused on. I mean, if I think about our potential 3 vectors of growth moving forward, one of them is we want to continue to be the machine that unlocks the value of data in sport. So we want to continue to build out our wheel of unlocking that skeletal data. And there may well be further acquisitions in that space. The second is we want to democratize our technology. So the data that we collect at the pro game, we can filter through the whole ecosystem down to amateur sports. And very much, particularly in sports like cricket and baseball, where there's a narrow field of view, we now are in a position where we can collect very similar data to the pro level on phones or on GoPros. And so that enables you as an amateur athlete to be able to collect the same level of data that the pros are getting, and whether that's for gamification, whether that's for talent development, whether it's for scouting, whether it's for recruitment, there's huge amounts of opportunity there. And interestingly, I've seen a step change over the last 5 years amongst sports of wanting to actually own the full ecosystem at the professional level, rather than when I was in the golf world, what we used to say was it's not our job to put golf clubs in the hands of youngsters. I think what pretty much every governing body is realizing now is your both commercially and just from a societal perspective, it is your duty. And then the third vector is around some of these emerging leagues. And we've partnered with some of them. And we think there is a huge opportunity for them to use technology as a way for them to differentiate themselves versus the incumbent league. So if I give an example, there's a new boxing league that's starting called Striker. And one of the big things, the issues people have with boxing is the scoring and the officiating is very opaque. You have a boxing fight for 12 rounds and at the end of it, one of the fighters' arms gets lifted up and everyone says, well, that wasn't 112, 110. So what we're able to do now with Striker, because we're tracking all of the athletes and their 29 body parts, we can actually see not only where each of the punches landed, but with which force each of those punches landed. And so you can effectively ascribe points to that on a real-time basis. So both the fans and the boxers themselves have transparency of who's in the lead, how many points behind they are. And it can not only fuel the fairness and the transparency of the sport, but it also unlocks fan engagement opportunities. Things like betting opportunities in game and stuff like that becomes a lot more accessible.
Yeah. My co-founder Scott knows the Striker guys. He was with them in London last time, so super cool what they're doing as well, and to see their tech integrations, and so I'm sure they'll appreciate that shout out as well. And they might have even been on the podcast as well. Me and Scott started splitting them. So I know we've talked a lot about youth. We've talked a lot about Sony and what you're trying to do and what you guys are trying to do. What else is? I mean, you've been in sports for a while now. You've stayed in it. What number one keeps you in it, and then number two, what are you excited about? What are you watching? Whether it's relevant or not to Sony. Just how do you see the space as a whole from, Rufus as a personal?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that I'm incredibly excited about, and this is somewhat within our business, but somewhat adjacent, is the ability to use sports data to make sport better. And I often talk about Moneyball 2.0. I mean, we had Moneyball where we were using sports data for rostering and talent recruitment, etc. 10, 20 years ago with the Oakland A's. Actually, I think the next generation of that is using biomechanical performance data. And if you can start to have that data at all levels of the ecosystem, it can make such a big difference in terms of how people think about recruiting talent, how people think about looking after their talent, how we can keep the stars on the pitch for longer. And I think as we start to get more data and we start to understand how to use that data more effectively, I think that's going to have a huge impact on the sports industry over the next 5 to 8 years. The second thing that I'm incredibly passionate about personally is trying to ensure that young people have the opportunity to participate in sport, and whether that is participating through consuming the way they want to, or participating more generally themselves. I do go back to that point I made previously. I think we've done a pretty bad job at that. And I think it's so important for our society, particularly as things get more fragmented, that sport acts as this unifier and this cohesive thing. And so anything that we can do with technology and data to continue to advance that is something that I'm always going to be very much promoting.
Yeah, you sit in a cool spot because you're at a very much a tech company that has both software and hardware, so you can see where a lot of things are going. But then again, you're coming from the sports world and tailoring towards it. So, so I really appreciate your perspective, and why it was good to have you on the podcast. Super interesting to hear how you think about it. Now, last thing, I was going to end it there, but I wanted to lean into the one point you just said right there, is you talk about everything fragmenting more, right? And again, this is more macro and broad. Why do you believe that is? Is it AI? Is it just, more communities? Is it just people tailored towards their own interest, algorithms? Why do you see that? And then why do you see sports as, the unifier of this all?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things when we speak to sports leagues that they recognize is that they need to do a better job of engaging people on all different platforms. And as we know, how content is getting consumed now is incredibly fragmented versus how it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. And so I think giving people the opportunity to have those water cooler moments through sport is something that is incredibly important. But in order to do that, you have to provide content in the types of products that people want to consume on the platforms that people want to consume. And so the distribution strategy needs to become more fragmented in order to hit people where they're consuming content. But ultimately, the themes, the narratives, and the storylines need to be consistent to create that sense of community.
Yeah, that makes sense. So where can people learn more about Sony Sports? Where's everything, where you guys live, whether they want to work with you from a league perspective, or just want, are curious or just listening, they want to learn more? Where's the best place to, you guys have like sony.com/sports, or where's the best spot?
Yeah, so we're actually working through launching Sony Sports as a B2B facing brand. At the moment, we are just a umbrella organization for our 5 portfolio companies. So please,
you're the Navy SEALs of Sony Sports right now, just covert operations for now.
Exactly. But we've got obviously the 5 businesses: Hawkeye, Pulse Live, Beyond Sports, Kinatrax, and Stat Sports. So, but we're pretty well networked into the sports industry, but always looking for other opportunities to expand our portfolio or to work with great people in the industry.
I love it. Well, appreciate you coming on, and I think this was a good, a lot of good insights in this one that people can pull from. So appreciate the stats and all the wisdom.
Fantastic. Thanks, Andrew. Enjoyed it.